ecosystems. Aquatic ecosystems are those containing water. Let us first look at the pond ecosystem. Pond is a freshwater ecosystem, and it is a shallow ecosystem. That means the depth is less compared to a lake or a river. But it is a self-sufficient, self-regulating system. That means it contains everything that is required for the maintenance of that system in terms of abiotic and biotic factors. Therefore, it is a self-sufficient and a self-regulating system. Let us first look at the abiotic components or the non-living factors of pond ecosystem. These are inorganic and organic substances such as nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, humic acid, amino acids, and other. Then the physical conditions of the pond, like the temperature, the light penetration, the pH of the water, all of these constitute the abiotic component. Let us now look at the biotic component. Biotic component means the living factors. The first are producers. Producers are organisms capable of producing their own food. In pond ecosystem, the producers are grouped into two major types. First are macrophytes, and second are phytoplanktons. Macrophytes are large plants. These may be rooted in soil of the pond. They may be submerged either completely or partly. Then there will be free-floating plants and others known as emergent plants. Emergent plants are found at the edge of the pond. They are rooted in soil, but they grow above the water surface. So what are the examples of macrophytes that can be found? Typha, Vallisneria, Hydrilla, Lemna, Eichhornia, Azolla. All these plants or species of plants are the macrophytes present in pond ecosystem. Then Second group of producers are known as phytoplanktons. Phytoplanktons are minute, they are small in size, and they are found floating on the water surface. These are carried from one place to another with the help of water currents. Now, these are phytoplanktons. That means they are capable of producing their own food. What are the examples of phytoplanktons? Spirogyra, bivalves, Chlamydomonas. All these are the phytoplanktons present in the pond. Let us now look at the consumers in the pond ecosystem. The first are primary consumers. In pond ecosystem, few animals are associated with living plants. These are known as benthos. So beetles, mollusks, crustaceans, insect larvae, they fall into this category. Mollusk means snail-like animals. They are soft-bodied animals. Crustaceans means shrimp that may be present in the pond. Beetles are insects. So all these plants, they are associated with living plants and they are known as benthos. These are the primary consumers or which feed on the plants that are present in the pond. Then second organisms, which are also known as zooplanktons. Zooplanktons are crustaceans like cyclops, protozoans like Buglina, rotifers like Ilidae. All of these are the primary consumers or they feed on the producers that are found in the pond ecosystem. Let us now see the secondary consumers. These are few insects and fish that are found in the pond. Tertiary consumers will be large fish like game fish. And of course, the decomposers will be bacteria and fungi. So what kind of fungi are found in the pond ecosystem? Trichoderma, Fusarium, Pythium. These are the fungi which are found in pond ecosystem. So this is a very good diagram showing pond ecosystem. So you can see here there are macrophytes and a few phytoplanktons, then the zooplanktons, then the small fish and the game fish. So the animals which are associated with these plants, okay, you can find them here, beetles and the crustaceans and the mollusks. Then these animals, they will feed on the plants and the phytoplanktons. Then small fish will feed on these and larger fish will feed on small fish. So larger fish will be the tertiary consumers. This is a diagram showing pond ecosystem. You can see here sun is a source of light for the green plants or the producers that are found in the pond. So we have different macrophytes and the phytoplanktons that together constitute the producers in the pond ecosystem. Then we have organisms feeding on the phytoplanktons and the green plants, that is macrophytes. So these are known as primary consumers or herbivores. There are certain animals which feed on the primary consumers. These are known as secondary consumers, which are small fish in the pond ecosystem. And large fish, they are the tertiary consumers or the top carnivores. The soil of the pond also contains decomposers, which are fungi and bacteria. Let us now look at marine ecosystem. The example is ocean. The major oceans of the world are Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, Arctic Ocean, and Antarctic Ocean. When we compare marine ecosystem to freshwater ecosystem, marine ecosystems are more stable in chemical composition compared to freshwater ecosystem. Marine ecosystems are essentially saline. They have higher salt content in their water. You must have heard coral reefs found in oceans are one of the most diverse ecosystems. They support a great variety of plant and animal life. So the producers in the oceans are planktons. That is diatoms, dinoflagellates, also certain seaweeds like brown and red algae. And you all know that chemosynthesis is one of the process which takes place in deep ocean. So all of this, the chemosynthetic bacteria, planktons, they are the producers in the oceans. Then what are the consumers? Primary consumers are the crustaceans, like shrimps, different types of shrimps, then mollusks, soft-bodied animals. Then fish. Secondary consumers are carnivorous fish like mackerel, herring. Ter- Tertiary consumers are fish like haddock, halibut, cod. So these are different types of fish which function as secondary and tertiary consumers. And decomposers, of course, they are bacteria and fungi. A few marine worms are also there, which function as decomposers in the marine ecosystem. Yes, this is a slide showing images of different fish. This is mackerel, then herring, and the haddock. So mackerel and herring, these are the secondary consumers, and haddock, it falls in the tertiary consumer category. The next topic of the syllabus is food chain. Let us first look at the definition of food chain. The transfer of food energy from producers to herbivores to carnivores and then to decomposers is known as food chain. You all know that producers fix solar energy and store it in the form of complex carbohydrates. So, this energy moves from producers to primary consumers, then to secondary consumers, and then to tertiary consumers. This is known as food chain. A simple example of food chain can be given as grass is eaten by grasshopper, grasshopper will be eaten by frog, frog will be eaten by a snake. And during the course, the energy from grass will be transferred to grasshopper, then to frog, and finally to the snake. This is known as food chain. So each of this feeding level is known as trophic level or the nutrition level. So this is the first trophic level, second trophic level, third, and the fourth. So the feeding forms the trophic level. In nature, two types of food chain are found. First food chain is grazing food chain. Grazing food chain begins with living green plants, then it goes to herbivores, and then finally ends in the carnivores or the consumers. This food chain is dependent on influx of solar radiation. So solar radiation is required, or solar energy is required by the green plants to produce food. That is why grazing food chain depends on influx of solar radiation. In pond ecosystem, phytoplankton is eaten by a zooplankton and then by a fish. So this is a grazing food chain which occurs in pond ecosystem. So producer is the phytoplankton, or for that example, we have also seen there are different macrophytes which can be the producers in the pond ecosystem. So it is beginning with living green plants, then these are eaten by zooplankton, and zooplankton is eaten by a fish. So from producers, it will end in consumers. In grassland ecosystem, grass is eaten by rabbit, rabbit is eaten by a fox. So grass is a producer and fox is a consumer. So in grassland ecosystem, it began with a producer, that is a green plant, and it has end in consumer, which is a fox. So this type of food chain is known as a grazing food chain. Then the second type of food chain is detritus food chain. It begins with organisms feeding on dead organic matter. That means it begins with decomposers and ends in consumers. Now it is less dependent on influx of solar radiation, and it is mostly dependent on the influx of organic matter because it begins with the organisms that feed on dead organic matter. Example, let, let us see in mangrove ecosystem. Mangroves are plants found in coastal areas, bordering the coastal areas. So in the mangrove ecosystem, when the leaves fall off the trees, these leaves are acted upon by fungi, bacteria, and protozoa. Protozoa are single-celled organisms. These are eaten by insect larvae, shrimps, and mollusks, which are further eaten by game fish, and game fish is eaten by birds. So, this food chain began with fallen leaves and it ended in a consumer. Therefore, such type of food chain is known as grazing food chain. So let us revise. Food chain is the transfer of food energy from producers to herbivores to carnivores and then to decomposers. Now this is a simple food chain where grass is eaten by grasshopper, grasshopper is eaten by a frog, frog is eaten by a snake. So this cycle of eating and being eaten can be called as a food chain in simple terms. Then there are two types of food chains. First is the grazing food chain, which begins with living green plants and ends in consumers. It is dependent on the influx of solar radiation. So in pond, the phytoplanktons or the macrophytes are eaten by zooplankton. Zooplanktons are eaten by fish. So it began with the green plant or the producers. Then in grassland ecosystem, grass is eaten by a rabbit, rabbit is eaten by a fox. So here it began with the living green plant or the producers. The second type is detritus food chain, which begins with organisms feeding on dead organic matter. It is less dependent on the influx of solar radiation, but more dependent on influx of organic matter. So we took the example of a mangrove ecosystem where the fallen leaves were acted upon by fungi, bacteria, and protozoa. These were feed these were eaten by insect larvae, shrimps, and mollusks. Shrimps are the crustaceans, mollusks means snake-like animals, soft-bodied animals. So these are eaten by game fish, and game fish in turn is eaten by a bird. So it began with the dead organic matter and ended in a consumer. Yes, this is a diagram showing the detritus food chain in the mangrove ecosystem. So this is a tree whose leaves have fallen in the water, which are acted upon by fungi, bacteria, and protozoa. They are eaten by a group of organisms called as detritus consumers. Then these detritus consumers are eaten by small carnivores, which is game fish, and then the game fish will be eaten by top carnivore, which is a bird. So this food chain began with the influx of dead organic matter and ended in the carnivores. Now, having understood the food chain, let us see what is the meaning of a food web or what is a food web. So an interlocking pattern formed by several food chains connected together is called food web. Okay, that means in nature, the linear arrangement of organisms, that is, this that grass is eaten by rabbit, will be eaten by fox. This is very rarely seen. So, at every trophic level, there are alternatives, and it forms a form of interlocking pattern, and that is known as food web. So this is a very good picture showing the food web in the grassland ecosystem. So in the grassland ecosystem, grass will be eaten by rabbit, rabbit will be eaten by a hawk. It might happen that grass will be eaten by a grasshopper. Grasshopper will be eaten by a lizard, and lizard will be then eaten by a hawk. Or grass will be eaten by a mouse. Mouse will be directly eaten by a hawk, or mouse will be first eaten by a snake, and snake will be eaten by a hawk. Or grass is eaten by a grasshopper, then grasshopper can be directly eaten by a hawk. So there are always alternatives at every trophic level. So the primary consumers in the grassland ecosystem can be a grasshopper, can be a rabbit, can be a mouse. So if rabbit is not present, grass will be still eaten by a mouse. If snake is absent, mouse will be eaten by a hawk directly. So at every trophic level, there are alternatives. So this is known as a food web. Okay? The feeding of the organisms or the different food chains, they form a sort of interlocking pattern that is known as a food chain. Never or very rarely the linear arrangement exists. It is this, that grass will be only eaten by a grasshopper, or grass will be only eaten by a rabbit, and rabbit will only eat a will be only eaten by a fox. This will rarely happen because if rabbit is not there, grass will be still eaten by a mouse. So there is an alternative for rabbit in the grassland ecosystem. So that forms this interlocking pattern, which is known as a food web. Yes, then this is a food web in pond ecosystem. In pond ecosystem, we have seen the producers can be macrophytes, that is the rooted plants. They can be phytoplanktons, that is the algae or that spirogyra and all that. So here, the macrophytes can be eaten by an insect larvae, beetle, mollusks, that are soft-bodied animals, snails, and crustaceans. Anyone can feed on these rooted plants. Then these might be eaten by some other insects. And then this insect might be eaten by a game fish. The phytoplanktons will be eaten by zooplanktons. Zooplanktons will be eaten by a small fish, and that small fish may be eaten by a will be eaten by a game fish. So this is a linear arrangement which might happen. But phytoplanktons can be directly eaten by a game fish. Macrophytes can also be directly eaten by a game fish. Or the phytoplanktons may be eaten by insects, then this insect will be eaten by a game fish. Then the macrophytes will be eaten by the crustaceans, mollusks. These will be eaten by the insect and the game fish. So there are always alternatives at every trophic level. Either there will be a direct feeding, so game fish here might function as a primary consumer or the herbivore if it directly eats the producers. Okay, if these producers are eaten by insect, so this insect will be the primary consumer or the herbivore. This insect will be eaten by game fish, so game fish here will become secondary consumer. So that this difference will be there always because alternatives are there. So the feeding patterns, they form a web, and therefore they are not, the feeding is not linear. Okay, the food chain is not linear, it is always forming a interlocking pattern. Therefore this is known as a food web. Okay, so let us now revise what is a food chain. The transfer of food energy from producers to herbivores to carnivores and to decomposers is known as a food chain. So producers, which are green plants, they act as food for the primary consumers. Primary consumers will act as food for secondary consumers, and secondary consumers will act as food for tertiary consumers. So this is a simple food chain where grass is eaten by a grasshopper. Grasshopper will be eaten by frog. Frog will be eaten by a snake. In nature, there are two types of food chain: grazing food chain and detritus food chain. Grazing food chain begins with living green plants. See here, the phytoplanktons or the macrophytes, they will be the living green plants. Here also grass, and it ends in consumers. You can see here the fish and fox, they are the consumers. It is dependent on the influx of solar radiation. Why? Because green plants, they require solar energy for producing the complex carbohydrates, that is their food, during photosynthesis. So in pond, the grazing food chain can be phytoplankton, then zooplankton, and then fish. In grassland ecosystem, the grazing food chain can be grass, then rabbit, and then fox. Then detritus food chain. Detritus food chain, it begins with organisms feeding on dead organic matter, and it will end in consumers. It is less dependent on influx of solar radiation, but more dependent on influx of organic matter. Example is mangrove ecosystem. Now, mangroves are the plants found in the coastal areas. Okay. So they are lining the coastal areas. In that, the fallen leaves of the mangroves are acted upon by fungi, bacteria, and protozoa. Protozoa are single-celled organisms. Then this group is eaten by insect larvae. Okay, and they will be eaten by game fish, and game fish will be eaten by birds. So this is detritus food chain. See here, the leaves of the mangroves have fallen, acted upon by a group of organisms which feed on those uh, fallen leaves. They are acted upon by fungi, bacteria. So these will feed upon the organic matter that is there. They are known as detritus consumers, and these will be eaten by game fish. Game fish in turn will be eaten by the birds. Okay. Then we have seen what is a food web. Okay. In nature, the linear food chain rarely exists because at every level there are alternatives. So an interlocking pattern which is formed by several food chains connected together is called as a food web. Okay. So in the grassland ecosystem, in the absence of rabbit, grass will be eaten by a mouse, and mouse will be either eaten directly by a hawk or it will be eaten by the snake, and snake will be eaten by the hawk. Grass might also be eaten by a grasshopper, which will be eaten by a lizard, and lizard will be eaten by a hawk. Or grass will be eaten by a grasshopper and then by a hawk. So this linear food chain is not or is rarely found. Okay, because anytime there are alternatives present at every trophic level. Okay? In the absence of rabbit, grass will be still eaten by a mouse. Okay? Then this is a food web in pond ecosystem. So in the producers that are present will be directly eaten by the game fish. In that case, the game fish will be called as a herbivore because it is eating the producers. It will be the primary consumer, or these producers will be eaten by the beetles and mollusks. Then these will be eaten by some other insect, and that insect will be eaten by game fish. If this is the case, then these group of organisms will be primary consumers. In this insect will be a secondary consumer, and the game fish will be a tertiary consumer. Okay, so the food chains are interlinked, and that forms a food web. And let us look at the importance of food web. What is the importance of food web? Food web helps to maintain the stability of an ecosystem. Then, increase or decrease in population of herbivores affect the consumer that prefers that herbivore. Okay? So, herbivore in this case is a rabbit. Here, if the population of rabbit decreases, then the tertiary consumer, which or the secondary consumer or the carnivore that favors rabbit will disappear slowly from the ecosystem, or the population will decrease. So increase or decrease in population of herbivores affect the consumer that prefers that herbivore. In the absence of herbivore, producers would have increased in number and perished due to increased competition. Okay, if there were no herbivores, then the green plants or the grasses for that matter in grassland ecosystem would have increased in number, and there would be a greater competition between them, and they would have perished. So this is the importance of food web, that it helps in maintaining the stability of an ecosystem. It increase or decrease in population of herbivores would affect the consumer that prefers the herbivores. In the absence of herbivores, the producers would have increased in number and perished due to increased competition. So, how complex a food web can be, it depends upon the length of the food chain, that is, diversity in the food habits. Now, for example, in the grassland ecosystem, if the hawk is eating rabbit and it is also eating a lizard, it is also eating a snake. So its habit are diverse. So it increases the length of the food chain. and therefore in turn increases the length of the food web. Then alternatives at each trophic level. So here you can see the primary consumers. There are three different types of primary consumers. So in the absence of rabbit, grass can be eaten by a mouse in the grassland ecosystem. In the absence of mouse, grass may be eaten by a grasshopper. So there are alternatives. This is a primary, these all are the primary consumers or the herbivores, but the alternatives exist at this trophic level. So the complexity of the food web will depend upon the length of the food chain or the diversity in the food habits of different organisms and alternatives that are present at each trophic level. In deep oceans, the food web are more complex. So let us revise what we have studied today. We have discussed the aquatic ecosystems, in which we have discussed a freshwater ecosystem and taken the example of pond ecosystem. So we have discussed the different abiotic components and the biotic components. The biotic components in the pond ecosystem are macrophytes, that is the large plants, and phytoplanktons, that is different minute um, organisms which are which are taken from one place to other with the help of water. So these are the examples. And we have discussed what are different consumers in the pond ecosystem. We have also seen what is the meaning of benthos, which are nothing but the animals which are associated with living plants. Then the secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, decomposers in the pond ecosystem. And yes, we have discussed this diagram. This is a diagram of pond ecosystem. Then we have discussed about the marine ecosystem, which is oceans. They are high in salt content, but chemically more stable compared to freshwater ecosystem. Then the different producers of the oceans, planktons, chemosynthesis which occurs in deep oceans, then seaweeds, and consumers which are mostly the fish. So mackerel and herring as the secondary consumers, haddock as the tertiary consumer. And decomposers are the microbes and that is the bacteria and fungi and also few marine worms. Then the food chain. Food chain, that is the transfer of food energy from producers to herbivores to carnivores and then to decomposers, that is known as a food chain. And we have seen a simple example: grass is eaten by grasshopper, grasshopper is eaten by frog, frog is eaten by a snake. So this is a food chain. Then there are two types of food chains identified in nature: grazing food chain, which begins with living green plants and ends in consumers. It is dependent on the influx of solar radiation. Then we have seen the detritus food chain, which begins with the organisms which feed on dead organic matter and ends in the consumer. It is more dependent on the influx of organic matter. We have discussed this in case of mangrove ecosystem, and we have also seen the diagram where you can see here the leaves which fall off the mangroves are acted upon, that is the dead organic matter is acted upon by fungi bacteria. Fungi bacteria are eaten by a group of organisms known as detritus consumers. Then the small carnivores and the large carnivores. Then we have seen what is a food web. In nature, the linear arrangement or the linear arrangement of organisms, it rarely exists, and it exists in the form of an interlocking pattern of several food chains. So several food chains, they form a sort of interlocking pattern that is referred to as a food web. So we have discussed this food web in the grassland ecosystem and in the pond ecosystem. So we have seen what is the importance of food web, that the food web are extremely important in maintaining the stability of an ecosystem. So if and also if there is increase in the population of herbivores, the consumer that prefers that herbivore will increase. If there is decrease in the population of herbivore, then the consumer that prefers that herbivore will decrease. And in the absence of herbivores, the producers would have increased in number and perished due to competition. Then we have discussed how complex a food web can be. It all depends upon the diversity in the food habits of different organisms that are found, and also the alternatives at each trophic level. So the food web can become more complex if alternatives at each trophic level are more.